Daniel Westbrook believed a man's worth could be measured in what he refused to let fall apart. Not just the company he'd spent 11 years building from a rented office above a dry cleaner in Hamilton into a logistics firm with 40 employees. Everything. His marriage. His house. The version of himself his father had raised him to be. For 19 years, the center of that belief had a name, Renee. But for the last 16 months, his wife had become a stranger who happened to share his address. No more falling asleep with her hand on his chest. No more humming while she cooked. She'd started taking calls in the garage with the door pulled shut, and she'd stopped meeting his eyes at dinner. Their son Caleb, 17, and usually oblivious to everything except hockey and his phone, had even asked once if Mom was mad at Dad. Daniel ran operations the way he ran his own head, looking for the failure point before it became a shutdown. Tonight, sitting in the driveway with the engine off, he had a manila envelope on the passenger seat. Divorce papers, signed an hour earlier in a parking lot outside his lawyer's office in Burlington, his hand steadier than he'd expected. He hadn't planned to file yet. He'd told himself he wanted one more real conversation first, the kind they hadn't had in over a year. He came in through the mudroom, the way he always did, and the house smelled like the rosemary bread Renee only made when she needed her hands busy. For a second, that smell undid something in him he'd been holding together for months. He stood in the kitchen doorway, very still. That's when he heard her voice from the back deck. If you've landed on this channel for the first time, this is the kind of story we tell here. The kind that takes something broken and shows you exactly how it gets put back together. Subscribe if that's the kind of thing you need tonight. Now, back to that kitchen in Hamilton. The sliding door was open 3 inches, just enough to let in the damp early spring air off the lake. Renee's voice was low, and it was shaking in a register Daniel had never once heard from her in 19 years of marriage. Not the careful clip tone she'd been using with him for over a year, but something raw, barely holding its shape. "Pam, I can't keep doing this alone." Pam, Renee's younger sister, the one who lived in Oakville and called constantly, whose name had been showing up on the phone bill at hours that made no sense for 2 sisters who supposedly talked about nothing more than recipes and their mother's hip replacement. "He's filing, Pam. I know he is. I can see it on him. But I can't tell him. Not after what happened with his mom. Not when he just made regional director." A breath that sounded torn out of her. Stage 3. They found it in February. Daniel's hand closed around the doorframe. "I've been doing the infusions on my lunch break at the clinic on Main, telling everyone at work it's allergy shots. I didn't want him watching me get smaller. I didn't want him to look at me the way he looked at his mother." The envelope in the car suddenly felt like something he'd carried into the wrong building. 16 months of cold mornings, of silent dinners, of telling himself a story about a woman pulling away from him towards someone else. All of it came apart in the space of one sentence. This wasn't infidelity. This was the loneliest kind of love he'd ever come across, the kind that closes its own door and tries to bleed quietly on the other side of it so no one has to watch. He hadn't been losing his wife to another man. His wife had been trying to spare him a second front-row seat to a death, and in doing it, had nearly handed him a divorce instead. Stay with this one, because what Daniel finds out over the next several hours is going to rearrange everything you think you understand about silence, about love, and about what people are actually capable of carrying without saying a word. To understand how a man ends up standing frozen in his own kitchen with divorce papers in the car, you have to go back to where the first hairline crack actually showed up. Not the night it became impossible to ignore, but the small, almost forgettable moment before that, the one Daniel barely registered at the time. 16 months earlier, the Westbrook house felt, in Daniel's words, solid as poured concrete. He'd just been promoted to regional director at Cargill Freight Solutions, the milestone his father had predicted years before he died. "You've got the head for this, Danny. Don't waste it sitting in middle management being polite." His father had been gone 7 months by then, taken by pancreatic cancer the previous August, and the promotion landed in March feeling like two things at once, a win and a wound. Renee made him braised short ribs that night, his favorite, and lit the good candles, the ones usually saved for anniversaries. Caleb had drawn a lopsided caricature of his dad in a hard hat and taped it to the fridge. That dinner was the last one Daniel remembered as simple. 2 weeks after that, things began shifting in small enough increments that he told himself he was imagining it. Renee stopped reaching for his hand first. She started going to bed before him, then started staying up after him instead, claiming she couldn't sleep. She began taking her phone into the bathroom. She stopped asking how his day went, and somewhere in there, he noticed he'd also stopped offering. One evening, Caleb wandered into the kitchen while Daniel was eating alone at the counter and asked, flatly, the way teenagers ask things they've clearly been turning over for a while, "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" Daniel told him no, that they were just working some things out, and hated how much that sounded like something out of a counseling pamphlet. He couldn't locate the actual source of the distance. And for a man who built his entire professional identity around finding the weak point in a system before it failed, not knowing the cause of the failure in his own house was its own particular form of torment. There's a concept in family psychology that fits what Daniel was living through almost exactly. It's called ambiguous loss, first named by researcher Pauline Boss, the grief of losing someone who is still physically present. The person is right there at the table, in the bed beside you, but emotionally somewhere you can't follow. What makes it so corrosive is that you can't properly grieve someone's son who hasn't actually left. So the mind, starved of an explanation, builds one anyway. For Daniel, the explanation his mind built was an affair. He started cross-referencing the cell bill the way he reviewed shipping manifests, methodically, looking for anomalies. Pam's number showed up constantly, which made sense. But there were other numbers too, unfamiliar ones, recurring with a frequency that didn't read as casual to him. He told himself it meant nothing. Suspicion, once it's lodged somewhere, doesn't particularly care what you tell yourself. This is where a second, related pattern enters, what researchers call the demand-withdraw cycle. One partner senses the distance and starts pursuing, questions, glances, half-noticed clues. The other partner, already overwhelmed by what they're hiding, pulls back further. Each pursuit triggers a deeper retreat. Each retreat triggers a harder pursuit, and the two people end up locked in a loop neither of them consciously chose, each one's behavior generating exactly the response they were most afraid of. Renee's withdrawal deepened Daniel's suspicion. His suspicion deepened her need to hide. Neither one understood they were doing it to each other in real time. He started noticing things he'd been filing under tired. The new way she wrapped a scarf around her head some mornings, even indoors. The wince she suppressed reaching into the upper cupboard. The morning she came down, looking hollowed out, and said only, "Row night." He noticed every time. He said nothing every time. He called his older brother Marcus. No, his brother-in-law, the one steady voice in the family who wasn't directly implicated, and got the same answer twice. "Talk to her before you do anything you can't undo, Danny." He didn't talk to her. He called a divorce lawyer on a Thursday in late February instead. Not out of fury. The fury had mostly burned down by month 8. What was left by then was colder. The particular exhaustion of a man who's spent over a year knocking on a locked door and has finally stopped expecting it to open. Now standing in his own kitchen with the deck door cracked open and Renee's voice spilling through it, 16 months of suspicion folded in on itself into something he had no immediate name for. He backed out of the kitchen without a sound, went into the garage, and sat down on the cold concrete floor next to his own car. He put his face in his hands and cried in a way he hadn't since the week they buried his father. He cried for every silence he'd misread as rejection, for every theory he'd quietly constructed about betrayal. While 3 rooms away, His wife had been managing a cancer diagnosis on her lunch breaks, so he wouldn't have to watch. He'd been preparing to leave his wife. His wife had been preparing for a future where she might not survive long enough to need a divorce lawyer. Has anyone in your life ever tried to protect you with silence, and it ended up hurting worse than the truth would have? Tell us in the comments, or just type stayed or left. He sat in the garage past midnight. He heard her come back inside, heard the bathroom fan, the shower, the quiet of someone who'd long stopped expecting anyone to track whether she'd come home. The bedroom light went out under the door. He waited another hour after that before he finally went in, stood at the doorway, and looked at her, curled toward the wall, scarf still on, hands drawn in toward her chest even unconscious, like she was still holding something together in her sleep. He pulled the door shut without waking her and sat at the kitchen table until the sky over the lake went from black to gray. The next evening he came home at his usual time and moved through the house like the night before hadn't happened. After Caleb disappeared upstairs, he sat at the table and waited. Renee came in from the hallway, walking the way she'd been walking for months, careful, conserving something. She stopped when she saw him sitting there with his hands folded. Something crossed her face, guilt, fear, exhaustion, all at once. She set her phone face down on the counter, the same automatic little gesture of concealment he'd watched 100 times without naming it. His voice came out level. He'd already used up his tears the night before. "I heard you on the phone with Pam last night." The color left her face. Her knees actually buckled slightly. She caught the edge of the counter. She lowered herself into the chair across from him, the way someone sits when the last bit of holding it together has finally given out, and the tears that came weren't the contained, private kind she'd apparently been rationing for over a year. They were the full, heaving kind of someone whose secret has gotten too heavy to carry by herself any longer. "I was diagnosed in February," she said, "right after your promotion, right after we buried your dad." She pressed both hands to her mouth. "I couldn't tell you. You'd just taken on regional director. You were doing 60-hour weeks. You were still grieving him. And he died of cancer, Daniel. I watched what that did to you. I watched what it did to all of us." Her voice cracked open completely. "I didn't want you looking at me the way you looked at him those last months. Like you were already saying goodbye. I couldn't survive that twice." What Renee was describing has a name in family therapy: the protector trap. It happens when someone who loves deeply convinces themselves that suffering alone is an act of love rather than a withholding, that hiding pain spares the people around them. From the inside, it feels noble. It feels like sacrifice. But research on family systems is fairly consistent on this point. Hidden pain doesn't actually stay hidden. It changes how a person moves, how they make eye contact, how they respond to being touched. It doesn't vanish into silence. It transforms into exactly the distance and suspicion the person was trying to prevent in the first place. Renee hid her diagnosis because she loved Daniel completely, and in doing that, she built the very conditions that nearly ended the marriage. That isn't a character flaw. It's an old, deeply human reflex, especially in someone who's already watched illness wreck a family once. Renee's own mother had survived a brutal divorce during a health scare decades earlier, and that story had lived in her for years before it became relevant to her own life. When her diagnosis came, her first instinct wasn't rational. It was protective, ancient. "If I become the sick, fragile one, I will lose him, so I'll carry it myself." Daniel's instinct, faced with her growing distance, had been equally old, shaped by years of being the one who absorbs pressure without showing it. He hadn't asked. He'd endured and analyzed from a safe distance. Two people, two inherited survival strategies, both rooted in love, both aimed at protecting the same family from opposite directions, and both, running at the same time in the same house, had nearly torn it apart. Daniel got up from his chair, crossed the kitchen, and put both arms around his wife for the first time in over a year. She shook against him, gripping the back of his shirt like she was afraid letting go would mean falling. Neither of them said anything for a long time. When she steadied, he pulled back to look at her directly. "Are you still in treatment?" "Last round was 3 weeks ago," she said. "I'm waiting on scan results." He nodded slowly. "What else haven't you told me, Renee?" She looked down at her hands. "I sold my engagement ring," she said, "the original one, to cover what the benefits at the clinic didn't." A pause. "What else?" She didn't answer right away, and the silence answered for her. The bracelet his mother had left her. The set of pearl earrings from their 15th anniversary. Every marker of their life together, quietly converted into a war chest for a fight she hadn't told him she was in. His hands went flat and still on the table, the stillness of someone exercising serious control over himself. Then he picked up his phone and called his brother-in-law. "Marcus, I need you to pray for this family," he said, and something in his voice made Marcus go quiet immediately. "What happened?" "Renee's been sick. Over a year. I didn't know." A long pause. "Daniel, I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it before you say anything back." "Say it." "My mother knew. Renee's mom. She's known since the start. Renee called her the night she got the diagnosis and asked her to help keep it from you." The kitchen went silent. "There's a third pattern that belongs here. Family therapists call the family secret system. When a household is facing something serious, illness, shame, fear of losing the person who holds everything together, family members will sometimes organize themselves around a shared secret without ever formally deciding to. One person decides to protect the most vulnerable member, then another is pulled in to help carry it, then another. Slowly, without a single meeting where everyone consents, the family forms a sealed circle. The people inside believe, sincerely, that they're doing something loving. They mostly are. But every person inside that circle absorbs part of the weight, and every person left outside, in this case, Daniel, starts to feel the shape of something they can't see or name. They just know something's wrong. And that formless, sourceless dread is often more damaging than the truth would have been. Daniel had been the only person in his own family not trusted with the truth about his own family. He drove to his mother-in-law's place that same night, and what he found behind that door would open up a layer of this story nobody, including Renee, had fully reckoned with yet. Daniel drove across town with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, which told its own story. On easy days, he had the CBC on low. On hard days, he drove in silence and let himself think. He pulled into the driveway on Plains Road just after 9. The porch light was on, the way it always was. His mother-in-law kept it lit every night, said it was so nobody in the family ever had to walk up to a dark door. She opened it before he'd finished knocking, already crying. Not surprised tears, but the slow release of someone who'd been bracing for this exact conversation to her for a long time. "Come in," she said. They sat at her kitchen table. She didn't wait for him to start. She was terrified you'd leave her, her mother said. The same way her father almost left me, years ago when I got sick the first time. Renee was 12. She remembers all of it. It went somewhere deep in her, and it stayed there. A pause. The night she got her diagnosis, the first thing she said to me wasn't about the cancer. She said, "Mom, I can't lose him. I can't be the reason this family falls apart." Daniel stared at the table. He knew the broad shape of his mother-in-law's old story. A marriage that had nearly ended during a health crisis decades back, before he was anywhere near the family. He hadn't understood that the shadow of it had settled into Renee, too, and stayed there for 20 years waiting for a reason to matter again. "She should have told me," he said quietly. "I know that." His mother-in-law covered his hand with both of hers. "Love doesn't always see clearly, Daniel. She was fighting for her life and terrified of losing you in the same breath. That's an enormous thing for one person to carry by herself." Then the next thought arrived, cold and immediate. "Caleb," he said. His mother-in-law's eyes dropped. "He knows more than he should. Less than everything. He found the rest out from his son that night. Caleb was still awake, sitting up in bed with his knees to his chest, the lamp low. The second he saw his father's face, his eyes went bright with tears he was clearly trying to hold back. 17 or not. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed the way he had since Caleb was small. "Talk to me." Caleb told him, in the careful voice of someone who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long, that he'd found out 4 months earlier, by accident, gotten up for water in the middle of the night and found his mother in the bathroom, sick from the infusion, one hand braced against the wall, trying not to make any noise. "She looked so scared when she saw me," Caleb said. "Not scared of getting caught doing something wrong. Scared, I'd tell you. Did she ask you not to?" Caleb nodded, tears running silently now. "She said you were carrying enough already. She said the best thing I could do for everyone was let her handle it." He pressed his lips together. "I didn't know what to do, Dad. I'm sorry." Daniel pulled his son into his arms. "You don't owe me an apology. Not one." He held him until the shaking stopped, and sitting there in the low lamplight, he understood the entire architecture of what had been quietly assembled inside his own house without his knowledge. An entire family reorganizing itself around one act of protection, every single person shielding him from the very thing he would have done anything to help carry, if anyone had let him. When a household is in crisis, families often seal themselves around a secret without ever formally agreeing to it. The people inside believe they're acting from love, and mostly they are. But secrecy doesn't actually contain pain. It spreads it. It settles into a 17-year-old who's stopped sleeping properly. It widens the gap between two people who love each other and have forgotten how to close the distance. Kids absorb what adults don't say long before they understand why. Caleb had been carrying that weight quietly for 4 months, the same way the adults around him had, without realizing, taught him to. Daniel went straight to the bedroom when he got home. Renee was sitting up, waiting. She'd heard the car leave and come back. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed. His voice cracked once. "You really thought I was too weak to handle this?" "No, never." She shook her head. "I thought you were too good. I knew you'd hold yourself together for me and for Caleb. And you'd already lost your dad, Daniel. You were protecting me from my own family." She had no answer for that, only tears. Then, slowly, with the specific shame of exposing the thing she'd worked hardest to hide, she reached up and pulled the scarf off her head. Thinning patches where her hair used to be, new fragile growth along the hairline. Quiet proof of a fight fought entirely alone. "I felt so different," she whispered. "I didn't want you seeing me like this." Daniel broke completely. He pulled her close, held her face in both hands, let his own tears go without trying to hold any of it back. "You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever known. None of this changes that." They both wept, and in that unguarded moment, something sealed shut for 16 months finally came open. There's a final concept worth naming here. Silent strength syndrome, the deeply embedded belief, especially common in families shaped by generations of hardship, that showing need is the same as being weak, that the loving thing to do is suffer where no one can see you. Renee hid her illness because she feared vulnerability would cost her the marriage. Daniel buried his own fear because he believed a provider holds the structure together without showing the strain. Both of them operating from the same inherited script. Both suffering alone for exactly the same reason, love. What broke the pattern wasn't an ultimatum or a confrontation. It was one man in a dim bedroom, watching his wife take off a scarf and choosing honesty over composure. "I've been scared for 16 months, he said quietly, "and I didn't know how to say it." She leaned her forehead against his. "Me too." Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen and went still. "It's Dr. Okabe." He nodded. She answered on speaker, and they sat side by side on the edge of the bed and listened. The relief was audible in the doctor's voice before she'd even finished the first sentence. "Rennie, I'm calling with your scan results. The treatment worked. You're showing no evidence of disease." Rennie folded forward, hands over her face, shoulders shaking. Daniel wrapped both arms around her, and held on with everything he had. After a long moment, she lifted her face from his chest and whispered, "I had a plan. If I made it through this, I was going to ask you to renew our vows. Start over properly." He looked at her in the gray, early light coming through the blinds. "Then that's exactly what we're doing. Stay with this one, because the months of healing this family builds from here will genuinely restore your faith in the kind of love that holds on quietly and doesn't let go." They talked through what remained of the night, not the careful, guarded talking they'd been doing for over a year, where every sentence got measured before it left the mouth, but the other kind, the kind that happens once everything's already out in the open and there's nothing left to manage. Renee told him about the day she found the lump, about sitting alone in her car in the clinic parking garage for almost an hour after the biopsy results came back, in a building full of people she'd worked beside for 9 years, unable to walk back in and say it out loud to anyone. She told him she'd called Pam first, because Pam had once worked in oncology billing and would understand the clinical reality without falling apart in front of her. She'd called her mother second, because her mother was the kind of woman who could absorb grief and keep her hands steady doing it. "Why not me?" Daniel asked. Not an accusation, genuinely searching the way the most important questions are. Renee looked at her hands before she answered. "Because with Pam and my mom, I could fall apart and put myself back together before anyone else saw me the next morning. With you, I was scared that if I fell apart in front of you, I'd never be able to put myself back together, because watching you carry that pain would hurt worse than the illness itself. I know that doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," he said. "It doesn't mean it was right, but it makes sense." He told her, in return, what the last 16 months had looked like from his side of the silence: the cross-referenced phone bills, the lawyer, the signed papers sitting in the glove box of his truck right now. He didn't soften any of it. He let her feel the full weight, not to punish her, but because she deserved to understand the cost of the silence the same way he now understood hers. When he finished, she was quiet a long moment. Then, softly, "There were nights I almost filed myself. I thought about setting you free before you had to watch me get worse. I told myself maybe that was the kinder thing." A pause. "But I couldn't do it. I still loved you too much. And I was terrified that if I told you the truth, you'd stay out of obligation instead of love. I couldn't live inside a marriage built on pity." Two people in the same house, the same wound, approached from completely opposite directions, both of them so devoted to protecting the other that they'd nearly destroyed the thing they were protecting. It would have been almost unbearable, the sheer waste of it, if it weren't also, in its strange way, the clearest evidence of how much they actually loved each other. The next morning, Daniel stood at the counter with the divorce papers in hand one final time. Caleb sat at the table over cereal, watching him over the rim of the bowl. Renee stood in the bedroom doorway in her robe, both hands around a coffee mug, watching too. He held the papers up long enough for both of them to see clearly. Then he tore them in half, then in half again, until the pieces were too small to tear, and dropped them in the recycling bin under the sink. Caleb was out of his chair before the last piece landed. He crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around both his parents at once, 17 years old, and finally exhaling something he'd been holding for months. "We're actually okay now," Caleb said into the middle of it, muffled but clear. Renee laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the first one Daniel had heard from her in over a year, and pressed her face into his shoulder. He held them both and looked up at the ceiling and thought, simply, "Thank you." No particular address, just gratitude tossed out to whatever had kept this family intact long enough to reach this morning. A few weeks later, Daniel organized a small gathering at St. Andrew's, where Marcus, who'd been ordained as a lay minister years earlier and occasionally led services, said a few words over the family. Standing in front of people who'd watched this family for 2 decades, Daniel spoke honestly for the first time about what the last year and a half had actually been. "I almost left my family," he said. Because I stopped listening and started building a story instead. I spent my whole career finding the weak point in a structure before it failed, and I let the most important structure in my life crack for 16 months without asking the right question. He paused. From now on, we carry things together. No more protecting each other with silence. Rennie sat in the front row with tears running freely. Caleb sat pressed against her, watching his father with an expression of plain, fierce pride. His mother-in-law worked through a second tissue in the third pew. Pam had given up on composure entirely. What happened in that small church afterward is something family research rarely gets to document so cleanly. A family moving from crisis into actual restoration. The turn happened when shame got replaced by shared responsibility, not blame, which looks backward and assigns fault, but shared responsibility, which looks forward and asks how to carry something together from here on. What Daniel modeled that day, owning his own role in the silence, in choosing suspicion over honest conversation, was the exact thing that gave Renee permission to do the same. And what she did, by finally letting herself be fully seen, gave their son permission to set down the weight he'd been quietly carrying for months. Healing in families is almost never one moment. It's a series of choices, repeated over time, to keep choosing honesty over the comfort of distance. Over the following weeks, the changes were small but real. Daniel quietly cleared the balance on Renee's treatment costs using a portion of his bonus, without making a production of it, handled it the way he handled anything he considered his responsibility, and moved on. He worked with the clinic to shift Renee onto a schedule that let her be home for dinner more often. She resisted at first, the way people resist giving up routines that became a kind of shelter. But he made the case gently, over 2 quiet evenings. "I want you at the table," he said. "That's the whole ask." She agreed. The first night she walked in at 6 and actually sat down with both of them, not a plate left warming in the oven, an actual dinner. Caleb looked between his parents and said, with the blunt sincerity only a 17-year-old can manage without irony, "This is better." It was. Daniel and Renee started seeing a counselor together. Not because the marriage was still in crisis, but because they'd both learned, expensively, that love doesn't maintain itself. It needs tending. It needs the willingness to be honest, even when honesty is uncomfortable, especially when silence would be easier. What the counselor gave them, week by week, wasn't a list of rules. It was language, a way of saying, "I'm scared and I need you," without it sounding like failure. For 2 people raised to absorb hardship quietly, learning to receive turned out to be the harder, more important work. They brought Pam and Renee's mother back into regular Sunday dinners. Awkward at first. Conversations that took real nerve to start, but they started them anyway. And slowly the table got louder again, and Caleb started doing his homework at the kitchen counter the way he had as a kid, just to be near people. True forgiveness, the kind that actually holds, isn't the erasure of pain or a performance of cheerfulness over the top of it. It's the decision to rebuild trust while fully acknowledging what the damage cost. To say, "This happened, it cost us something real, and I'm choosing to move forward with you anyway." Couples who get through something like this don't survive because the fear disappears. They survive because both people commit, daily, to being seen by the person they most wanted to hide from. What Daniel and Renee were learning wasn't how to get back to who they'd been before. It was how to become something steadier, closer to the marriage they'd always wanted but never quite known how to build. 8 months after that night in the garage, on a Saturday evening in early June, with the lilacs out along the back fence, Daniel and Renee stood in their backyard and renewed their vows. Small, unhurried, just the people who mattered. Marcus officiated. Renee's mother had been there since morning, arranging flowers with the quiet authority of someone who treats hosting as a form of devotion. Pam had already cried twice before the ceremony started and showed no signs of stopping. Caleb stood beside his mother, holding the rings with a solemnity that made clear he understood exactly what they represented. Not just that evening, but everything it had cost to get there. The light came in low and gold, the way it does on the lake in early June, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory while it's still happening. Daniel held Renee's hands. Her hair was growing back now, soft and dark against the evening light. He looked at her a long moment before he spoke. "I used to think you'd stopped loving me," he said, voice steady, eyes not. "Now I understand you loved me so completely you were willing to carry all of it alone. The fear, the treatments, the cost, just to keep me standing. I'm asking you, right here, in front of everyone who loves us, to never do that again. Whatever's next, we carry it together. That's the only foundation I want." Rennie smiled at him through tears that had started the second he began speaking and showed no interest in stopping. "Thank you for listening," she whispered, "and thank you for staying." Caleb cheered loud enough for the neighbors. Renee's mother started the amen before Marcus had finished the blessing. The cancer was gone. The marriage had held. The cracks that once seemed unfixable had become, in every way that mattered, the strongest part of the foundation. But just when things had settled into something warm and ordinary, the dinner's loud again, the couch only ever used for sitting. Daniel's phone buzzed late one evening, while Renee dozed against his shoulder, the television low, the kind of unremarkable good evening he'd stopped believing was possible somewhere around month 5 of the silence. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A text. "Daniel, you still don't know the whole truth about those 16 months. It wasn't only the diagnosis. There's something bigger your family has been keeping from you." He read it once, then again, and set the phone down slowly on the cushion. Renee stirred at the change in him, lifted her head, and found him looking back at her with something on his face she hadn't seen in months, calm, but reading her now in a different way than before. "What is it?" she asked. He held her gaze a moment, then handed her the phone. She read it. Her face went still. Her hand, resting in his, tightened just slightly. The smile she gave back arrived a half-second too late. He turned the screen off. He didn't set the phone down. He sat very quietly in the lamplight of the living room they'd almost lost, in the house they'd almost left, beside the woman he'd almost let walk away from him without ever knowing why, and he thought about foundations. About what actually holds, about the difference between a crack that's been properly repaired and one that's simply been covered over. He kept her hand in his.